Hi, welcome back to my channel, Jess Plays a Part. I am Jess. This is a space where I talk about all things revolving stories such as books, video games, theater, music, anything. And today is going to be the quarter 3 book review. So I'm going to be reviewing every single book that I read for the third quarter of 2025. So that would be the months of July, August, and September. Yes, it's December as I'm recording and uploading this. We're not going to talk about that. So if you are unfamiliar, I will put any physical copies of books I have on my desk right there. And if I used a library or borrowed it for somebody and I don't have the physical copy anymore, I will smack a picture up somewhere. I don't remember which side it's on. Anyway, let's get right into these reviews. So the first book I read this quarter was The Boy in the Striped Pajamas by John Boyne. This is categorized as young adult historical fiction. This story is told through the perspective of Bruno, who is 9 years old, living in Berlin in the 1940s. The story begins with him learning he and his family are going to be moving from their home in Berlin to Poland for his father's work. Of course, being 9, he's very upset about this and tries to find a way to not move away from his friends, but ultimately is not successful, being that he's 9. Once they arrive to their new home in Poland in the middle of seemingly nowhere with no neighbors, Bruno notices off in the distance there is a large fence, and there are people within that fence wearing strange-looking pajamas. One day he decides to go exploring to see who these people in the funny striped pajamas are, and discovers a boy on the other side named Schmel. I do not know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, so please correct me if I'm wrong. Schmel happens to be Bruno's very same age down to the day, and they quickly become friends through daily visits, or mostly daily visits. Bruno also notices that Schmel is very thin and offers him food during these visits as well. Some time passes, and towards the end of the story, Bruno's mother decides that it's not good for Bruno and his older sister to be living out in the middle of nowhere, so they decide to go back to Berlin. When Bruno tells Schmel this news, Schmel reveals that his father has gone missing, and he's been missing for a couple of months at this point. Bruno decides that on his very last day in Poland before he moves back to Berlin, he is going to crawl underneath the fence and help Schmel find his father. They are unsuccessful in searching the camp, and the story essentially ends with them being caught up in a roundup for a march. I am hoping with the context you are able to determine that this is a story about the Holocaust, and the boys did perish in a death march. Since the book is written from a 9-year-old's perspective, there are a lot of things that are not given their proper names. For example, the camp that they have moved to be near is referenced as Outwith instead of Auschwitz. Bruno's father's boss, who comes to dinner every now and then, is called the Fury instead of the Führer. And just other little small details like that, which contextually in the brain of a 9-year-old would make sense. However, I don't believe it was as effective as the author intended it to be, especially when it comes to something like historical fiction. Even though it is a work of fiction, it is still very important to get some details correctly, and this is one of those things that I personally feel needs to be taught regardless of the age. You can kind of edit some things to make it age appropriate, but you still need to call things by their name. At this point, it's actually a big point of criticism from readers as well as researchers of the Holocaust, saying that it really detracts from the horrors of what occurred in these death camps and what happened to the Jews and the other residents of these camps. And the author had an interesting take on that. He self-described this book as a fable, and it relies more on the story aspect rather than historical accuracy. I understand his point to a certain degree. And reading this story as an adult, I can make those connections. I can absolutely figure out what is happening without it being spelled out. For the audience that this book was written, I don't know if they're able to do that without an adult guiding them to that point. And for that reason, I don't think it should be relied on as a true source of information. Story-wise, yes, it was good, but those inaccuracies really kind of marked it down, in my opinion. And for that reason, I am giving it 3 out of 5 stars. The next book I read was Somewhere Beyond the Sea by TJ Klune. This is a sequel to The House on the Cerulean Sea. So there is a bit of context that's I'm not going to be able to provide just because it is a sequel and I want to avoid spoilers as much as I can in these reviews. But the gist of the first book is that there is an orphanage for magical children in a world where magic is borderline illegal and it's very heavily surveillanced by the government. The head of this particular orphanage is named Arthur, who we discover in the prior book is a phoenix. And the events of this book, Somewhere Beyond the Sea, starts with him essentially having to be a character witness for himself regarding some of his darker moments of his past. But we quickly find out that this is in fact a character assassination phony trial in which they are trying to remove him from the orphanage and essentially shut it down in order to keep magical children and all magical people very much under wraps. Arthur and his partner Linus, who actually used to work for the government agency in charge of the magical surveillance, are also at the same time trying to very quietly bring in another magical child into their home without the government knowing that he is there and he has these gifts. When we first meet David, who is a Yeti, he proudly calls himself a monster and really has reclaimed that title for himself because that's what people call him, so it must be true. And so he's just going to lean into what people believe him to be rather than just the fun-loving theatrical kid that he naturally is. Arthur, Linus, and the other children who are residents of the orphanage help David see that it's okay to be his own self rather than what he is perceived as. I really enjoyed the first book of this series. I really enjoyed House on the Cerulean Sea. And in this book, we do get a lot more of the relationship between Arthur and Linus because the first book was essentially a whole will they won't they the entire time. So I'm glad that we were able to see some more aspects of their relationship as they've gotten to know each other and they've fallen in love with each other and all of that stuff. But aside from that aspect, this book really kind of fell short for me. I was really expecting a lot more. Aside from David, no other character had any kind of development. It was like all of them had their development arcs in the first book and then that was it. There was nowhere else for them to go. Which I did not really care for because, I mean, they're all children. They're constantly learning and growing and like people are constantly learning and growing. You tell me like they have nowhere else to go after the events of the first book? That just seemed odd to me. And another reason why I was not as much of a fan of this book as I wanted to was because the message of acceptance and celebrating your differences rather than being defined by them was really hit in the head too many times. That message was already well established in the first book, and I don't feel like it needed to be as hounded on in the second. So all that said, it was still a very cute book. It was a nice read, but ultimately I'm giving it 3.5 stars. The next book I read was Everything Everything by Nicola Yoon. This is young adult contemporary fiction, and it revolves around a teenage girl named Maddie. Maddie has never been outside of her home due to having severe allergies and health issues So she is essentially living in the bubble that is her home. She really only sees her mother, who is a doctor and does a lot of her care, and a nurse who comes to visit to assist with Maddie's daily care. One day, Maddie notices a family moving into the house next door who has a boy roughly her age, and she, of course, develops this humongous crush on him. She and Ollie, the boy that moved in, begin communicating in various ways through the windows. Eventually that leads to instant messaging and so on and so forth. And they end up talking every single day. One day, Maddie gets her nurse to sneak Ollie into their house so they can actually see each other for the first time. And they just fall so hard and so fast in love. Later, Maddie witnesses Ollie getting into a fight with his abusive father, and she quickly runs outside to intervene. And in doing so, blows her cover with her mom. She keeps trying new ways to see Ollie despite her mother's insistence on staying in the home because she is too sick and everything. And it all just kind of comes to a big head. I don't want to do any spoilers, so I will leave it at that. I enjoyed it for the most part. It was pretty predictable plot-wise, and I could have done without all of the teenage melodrama of, oh my god, there he is. I love him so much, even though I've only seen him through the window. Like, that's a little much for me, but, you know, dramatic teenagers will be dramatic teenagers. I feel like this melodrama was a lot more the focus when the plot could have done a little bit more without it. But overall, it was a decent read, and the theme of, outside of the teen romance of it, of the difference between living versus existing as a person, and that part I would have loved to dive into more. So with that, this is another 3.5-star read for me. The final book I read this quarter was Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. If you were an American in public school, you probably were assigned to read this. I did not realize how short it was. It is only, how many pages? Like 107 pages. Yeah, it is 107 pages long. I feel like we spent like weeks on this in high school. But if you're not familiar, the story is set in California during the Depression. We meet two migrant workers, George and Lenny, who are coming up to a ranch for work. George has more or less deemed himself Lenny's caretaker because Lenny, though he is quite a very big, strong man, he more or less has a mentality of a child. So he's very prone to getting himself into trouble. They find work together to work towards their dream of buying some land so they can build their own shack, plant their own food, and so Lenny can raise rabbits. That his primary goal in life is to have a rabbit farm. George is rather hard on Lenny at times just because they are trying to work toward this dream together, and with Lenny being the way that he is, often finds himself into a lot of trouble involving animal death, injury, and so on, just because he does not know his own strength. So George is trying to look out for him in that regard so they don't sacrifice their dream. Without revealing too much of the ending for this really old book that you were probably supposed to read in high school, the story ends in tragedy with George having to make a terrible decision in order to save Lenny from a worser fate due to some of the actions that Lenny completed, not realizing the harm he had done. So if you have not already read this, I really think it's something everybody should read. It's not that long. I think I read it in like 2 hours. So if you've got a couple hours, I do read fast, so that's, if you've got like half a day, you can definitely finish this in one sitting. Yeah, it's one of those things I think everyone should read, and it's assigned reading for a reason. Same with like 1984, Animal Farm, stuff like that. Like, especially for the time it was written, I think it's a wonderful commentary on like male friendship and how certain power structures are essentially bad for everybody involved. And this is another 3.5-star read for me. So that is it. Those are all of the books I read for the third quarter of 2025. It's a little bit shorter than my last few. You know, just life gets you sometimes, and sometimes you just don't have as much time as you would like to get some reading done. I'm hoping I can catch up to my reading goal this month, or at least get closer to it. I think I'm at like 18. And my goal was 24, so we'll see if that happens. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe if you haven't already, or follow me on other platforms. I am at jessplaysapart on here, on Twitch, on Instagram, on Blue Sky. Pretty much anywhere you can search Just Plays Apart, that's probably me. I normally stream twice a week. I stream gaming videos as well as a co-working session, writing session. My finger just popped. So I would love for you to join those as well. And I do post the VODs of my gaming videos on here as well. So go ahead and check those out if you haven't already. Thank you again so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!